Today, Open Source Security is talking to Dr. Kelley Masada, president of the Open Information Security Foundation. Kelley's here to tell us all about what it's like running an open source foundation. So Kelley, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited. You reached out and I was like, oh my goodness, like this is one of the topics because it is, I feel like there's so much just ununderstanding, I don't know if that's a word, around the foundations of open source and what they do and what they can and can't do and how they exist. So like, why don't you introduce yourself, introduce your foundation? We could talk a little bit about the project you've got, which is amazing, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. It's great to be here. I came into cybersecurity in a very weird way, which I won't bore your listeners with, but let it be known that I got introduced to open source because I was a victim of cyber stalking.
Oh,
and
wow.
my stalker used Tor. So that was my first personal sort of entree into what is this thing called open source software development and how do these communities work together. And as you can imagine, the Tor project was really this huge kind of powder keg of great work, crazy work, lots of stuff. When I started my PhD, I actually ran into someone who said, hey, we're running an open source foundation looking after this security software called Suricata. Would you be interested in joining? I'm like, why? And they're like, because we need someone who's kind of keep the lights on. And I was like, well, let me look at the website. So I looked at their website. I sent one of the founders a very long email saying, this is crap. I don't know how you guys are making any money or doing anything. But I'm happy to lend a hand. So that is, oh my gosh, Josh, it's going to be 13 years in March.
Wow.
And it was funny. It was one of those moments in your career that you're like, okay, well, I'll do this for 6 months. We'll see what happens. Suricata is a very, very technical IDS and IPS that I was like, oh yeah, they're not going to want me. Even though I was working on my PhD, and I have a very funny story to talk about because I was like halfway through. I think I was a year into my PhD when I joined OISF as president. And I remember asking Victor and some of my other team members, I'm like, hey, can you guys sit with me and help me with my cryptography homework? And they're like, oh, no, Kelley, we're going to go out for beers. Good luck. Have fun dialing into class while we're all going to go out for beers. I'm like, you're a bunch of jerks. About this. But anyway, that's the long version of joining OISF many years ago. Really seeing open source from a lot of different angles, and it's been a wild, wild ride.
I have no doubt. Okay, so let's talk about Suricata first, because I worked at Elastic for like 5-6 years, and Suricata was all over the place in that universe. So tell us what Suricata is, and then we'll dive into the foundation.
Yeah, so Suricata is an open source network monitoring technology software, both IDS and IPS. It's got lots of dynamic features. Suricata came onto the scene because Victor Julian saw some things in Snort back in the day in 2009 that was missing, and he thought that there's a way that we could do this all better. And so he built the first code of Suricata back in the day. And, thankfully, the founders who were Matt Yonkman, Will Metcalf, and Victor Julian took a step back and said, we might need to actually fund this work at some point. And so instead of setting up a for-profit company, they actually set up a nonprofit, a 501c3 organization, which is OISF, to be the overseer of the project. So, but as you said, Suricata is in networks all over the world.
Yep.
All over the world.
It's an amazing tool. But I think all of the things you described and having the foundation tying it together is why it's successful and amazing, because open source isn't free. It is crazy expensive. So, okay, so explain the foundation concept to us now. So we have this amazing tool that One of the things, especially I think in the security world, we like to pretend, oh, we'll just open source it and people will come work on it. And that is totally not the way any of this works. And so the foundation model, I feel like, is working in many instances. It's not without its challenges, but like this is one of those particular instances. So why don't you explain to us, like, how does the OISF work? Like, what does funding look like? What do you do with that funding? It's not just like throwing keggers all day with the money you bring in. Like, there's obviously lots of things to pay for. Open source isn't free.
Right.
So yeah, so just kind of help us understand.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I dial this back for folks in different conversations, the first thing I say is that open source is a software development model. It's not a business. Okay. And I think people just automatically assume that open source is this business model that you can monetize and, bring communities together, which is a whole nother kettle of fish I'm happy to unpack for your listeners. But setting up the business around an open source project takes a lot of thought and sort of forward thinking. And there's lots of examples of different organizations doing it different ways, from commercial companies sort of putting things out into an open source space, but giving its own little corner of that enterprise, to example like OISF. So when OISF was started, and we will be celebrating, 15 years this coming September. So when OISF started, they got a first sort of round of money from DHS. So they got a bunch of money, hired a bunch of developers, thought this was going to be great. Didn't have any other idea about how to build a business model. And it was not, at any sort of slashing the founder, because they're like brothers to me. But back in that day, they started thinking about, okay, what's the license model for the software that we can actually build a business from? So that license model has always been kind of what I've described as, that's the first key decision to make. Because if you are a highly permissive open source license model like BSD, it will be very, very hard to fundraise. Suricata is GPL, which gives us the opportunity of having a non-GPL version of Suricata's code. So that's where the initial thinking started. And we're like, oh, okay, well, if we're going to have a non-GPL license offering, we can sell a license to that. Before I joined OISF, though, again, the founders, and again, there's lots of love here. They were like, you can have a perpetual license to Suricata. You can have a perpetual license to Suricata. It was like, just kind of, oh, give us, $50,000 and it's all great. I was like, I remember my first conversations and talking to them, like, so there's really no motivation for anyone to renew. So you're saying we're just going to hand stuff out. And I was like, wow, we've got to like really step back. And that's where, in the early days when I joined the organization, I said, we have to think about, what does a sustainable model look like? So it started with point releases, major releases. Okay, let's start thinking about that innovation and showing the innovation. Let's think about, how do we tie in that non-GPL license and what else can we offer? And then it evolved to, after listening to consortium members and others in our community, what are people asking for? And I remember sitting on a webinar probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and Seth Hall from the Zeek project said, open source projects, there's no support for open source. And I raised my hand. I'm like, we actually have a support services program for Suricata. So companies can buy support services where they get a direct link to our development team. Still lots of the community stuff, but now we are building other channels to bring people in. So there's a lot of complexity around it, while always the biggest challenge is always having your head in the space of, are we honoring our open source values?
Sure. Okay, so you were selling licenses to open source software basically as a nonprofit organization.
Yep.
I think in a lot of people's minds, we hear nonprofit and we think they don't sell things, they collect donations, they're like funded by the goodwill of humanity versus having like a business model.
Yeah. That's an interesting take, right? Because people also think that nonprofits are poor, right?
Right.
I mean, the NFL was a nonprofit for a long time.
Right. That's right.
But that aside, we had to think about what is that business model for us. And the lovely thing about nonprofit status is that it's a tax status. So as long as we are adhering to mission, we can raise money whatever way we need to raise money, as long as we do not step outside the lines of our mission. So it was a really great situation for us, because we could go in and say to a consortium member, we have a commercial license so that you can embed Suricata into your fancy, super sexy project or product, do all you want to it, keep it super secret, and we'll give you that license, but you need to support Suricata's development by being a consortium member. And they stepped in, they said, yeah, we'll do that because you're a nonprofit. Because I would always start off the conversation with, we are a nonprofit, we are not poor, and we don't need handouts. We need consortium members who are going to invest in Suricata. And this is the way to do it that wins for everybody.
That's pretty cool. Now, do you still do that where if you're a consortium member, you gain a non-GPL'd version of the project?
For certain levels. So we have a few levels that don't have a non-GPL, don't have the license attached, like for our support services members. Because there's lots of companies out there using Suricata that aren't putting it into a product. So having the non-GPL license isn't needed. So we're always working with consortium members to say, okay, you're using Suricata. Great. How visible do you want to be? What do you need? Would you like to have quarterly calls with our development team? Would you like to do some troubleshooting? Would you like us to amplify your brand as actually a supporter of open source? And it's funny you mentioned Elastic. I mean, Elastic had its own problems back in the day with, with open source. And I was watching from the sidelines going, I'm going to just see how this all plays out. And when the dust settled, I went to a couple of big organizations that I knew was using Suricata, and I said, if you guys want to put yourself out there as a supporter of open source development, I have a way for you to do it. Come join us. Let's talk about what we can do for you. So it very much is the business model that other companies operate by. But we really are always doing that constant balance of, are we community-centric? Are we maintaining our open source values? Are we serving the greater good with Suricata?
I mean, this is super interesting to me because there are tons of open source projects right now that are seeking funding. There's all these funding proposals and ideas that we see in the world, like the Sovereign Tech Fund is one example, in Germany, where they're using public funds to pay open source maintainers. You've got all these companies trying to do this sort of thing. And this feels kind of unique in the way Suricata is being funded, because I don't know of any foundation. I'm sure there are some, but I just don't know about them that are kind of taking it feels like we are a business, but you're not a business, which is intriguing to me. And I'm curious, do you think this approach made the members of your consortium more, I guess, willing to engage versus if you were just a strict for-profit business?
Oh, absolutely. Because I think they saw that the value of their support of Suricata was going directly to development. I mean, my team is 11 people, Josh. 11 people.
Wild.
10 are developers.
Wow. Amazing.
So there's one, hello. non-developer that is managing everything else. And it's not to sort of pat myself on the back, but it's to speak to the fact that the model of building OISF with developers that I can say wholeheartedly to a consortium member, all your funding is going to pay for those developers. And in the 12 years that I've been president, we have only lost one developer in 12 years.
Wow. And look, these are people working on a super advanced project, doing super advanced work. I guarantee they could all go to a private company and make quite a lot more money.
Don't say that out loud.
But no, I mean, I think that's important though, right? Because I think when you're dealing with this sort of structure, you have the sense of just accomplishment and contribution to humanity and in general, right? Like you have that purpose that you don't necessarily get at a commercial institution. You have companies funding the purpose to a foundation. Like this is intriguing, I think, because a lot of companies that try to do open source, you mentioned Elastic. I was there for it. Elastic is now Apache 2 licensed again. So I'll let everyone else kind of put all the dots in place for all that. But, I think, and like you said at the beginning, open source is a development model. It's not a business model. And I think a lot of organizations they don't know that. And then they figure it out way too late. And then they just like stab themselves in the leg by making horrible, stupid decisions.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to pitch and advise companies on is that you can't look at open source as this lovely little kumbaya experience in the corner that you can be like, oh, this is so cool and innovative and we're going to use it. We're going to just like bring it on in. You've got to look at this with the same or similar due diligence mind as you would any other vendor.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's wonderful that we have these initiatives that are like, hey, we have to start thinking about maintainers. We have to actually think about some of these guys and ladies are going gray and want to retire. I think about that all the time. What is the longevity of Suricata and OISF? What's the longevity of open source? And how do you keep people motivated? I mean, I thank my lucky stars every single day. And I actually left. I didn't technically leave. I resigned 2 years ago, but my board didn't accept my resignation. I went to go work for a commercial company. Didn't really leave, so I left the commercial company and came back to OISF. Because it was, to your point earlier, understanding that when you're working for mission, when you're working for this greater good, when you're trying to actually, bring people together in that space, whether it's a consortium members or contributors to Suricata's code, there's something that really is just inherent to say, yeah, I want to be a part of that. And the more that we can generate that kind of spirit and energy with the people involved, you get better code, you get sustainable open source software, you get innovation in these projects. But oftentimes we forget that when that energy and that spirit dies, all the other work dies with it or goes into maintenance mode.
Right.
If you're lucky.
Right. I mean, so that's a really good point. So let's talk about that. You're running an open source foundation. What does that look like? What does it mean to run an open source foundation? So I'll kind of give you, as a person not running an open source foundation, like I do some work with like the OpenSSF, so I've got some vague ideas, but even the Linux Foundation doesn't really count because their budget is hundreds of millions of dollars, which is completely ridiculous. Like no other foundation has that. And I think I see kind of two pieces here. There are some people that think, oh, every foundation's just like the Linux Foundation. They're like swimming in cash. They have no problems, which no, that's not true. But there's the aspect of like, so you have a foundation, you have to keep it alive, right? You can't like, what does that even mean? Like, how do you find people to join your consortiums? How do you find donations? How do you like keep the lights on year after year after year? Because it's not like you're doing work, right? It's not like people just show up with money and give it to you. You have,
I wish. No, and it keeps me up at night. I remember years ago, Victor and I were sitting in Amsterdam airport getting ready to go to Suricata. I think it was actually one of our first Suricons. And he looked at me just like out of the blue and he's like, "Do you ever stop thinking about OISF?" And I said, "No, never." Because I'm always trying to think about how do I, first of all, keep this group of people that truly are like family to me. How do I keep them fed and inspired and not looking for those big paying jobs that we're not going to talk about? That is a constant thing in my mind, but it's also keeping ahead of what is the trend in network security. Networks are never going to go away, but if you look at a Suricata or a Zeek or a Snort, this isn't new technology. So where's innovation going to come from? So you've got these technical challenges, you've got licensing challenges, you've got community challenges because people, it was great when everybody was working from home for a long time. Lots of folks were like, "Hey, we can spend a little time giving a little bit to Suricata because we're not commuting every day." But then everybody goes back to work and life goes back to normal. So you're constantly looking at all these different pieces, which can be daunting. And to be perfectly honest with you, when I thought about leaving OISF a couple of years ago was because I took a hard look in the mirror to think, is the barrier to OISF growing and Suricata growing me as a leader? And I spent 2 years working with the board of directors at OISF saying, what does our next decade look like? And because we were able to do that together with the board, inspired me to say, hey, oh my God, I can see it. I can see where we can go. And I walk around RSA with my Suricata stickers. And 9 times out of 10, as lovely as those people in the booths are, they have no idea that Suricata is under the hood of those products or in their networks. But I still walk around going, hey, who wants a Suricata sticker? And let me tell you about open source, because I know that we have untapped potential in bringing more consortium members into Suricata. It's our job to make it easy for them to do that. I don't want people doing it because they think it's just a nice thing to do. I want these organizations to come and support Suricata because it's a business need. It's not just a feel-good thing.
I mean, I think that's a really good way to look at it. And I feel like I've seen many open source projects that don't have any sort of way to sustain themselves just kind of peter out because you're basically just working a couple of people to death and then they run out of gas. And I feel like there's another piece of this when you just told your story about the future of Suricata and kind of planning the next decade. When you're in a position where survival is all you care about, you have no thoughts on the future. And I think a lot of open source projects are in survival mode 24/7. They have no concept of let's have a strategic discussion about the future. Right. And that feels important and powerful to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you look across 3 dimensions of that strategic thinking, the technology and where Suricata is going, the community of people, how do you strategically build that forward? And then the business. It's 3 things that are locked together, but very, very independent thinking when you have to kind of build all of them kind of at the same pace going forward. And I think a lot of projects always assume that they'll just be the fun, sexy, cool thing out there that everybody want to be a part of. And as I mentioned, Josh, I started at the Tor project. The Tor project had thousands of people involved, had a huge following, from developers to evangelists to advocates to like users. it was a completely different ball game. But even a project of that size, you have to keep your eye on all these components because people are fickle. They're fickle. They can get their feelings hurt. They can get bored. You know, they can have their time spent doing other things. I want to keep them engaged with Suricata. I mean, every single year we run Suricon, and I am humbled and in awe that we fill the room every year for 10 years running.
Wow.
And it is such a pain in the neck to put together. And I don't mind saying that out loud because I say it in front of all of them. I love people who come to Suricon, but I'm like, this is a pain in the neck. I hate building this thing.
Anyone who's ever worked on a conference ever before completely understands. You know, I've got a couple I help out with, and I'm like, why do people do this for free? What's wrong with us? Like, this is crazy.
Exactly.
But anyway, okay, so I want to kind of wind this conversation down with, I would value your opinion on, let's say I am in a position where I'm thinking about either starting a foundation, joining a foundation, doing something with a foundation. I've got an open source idea. We'll pretend like there's just not, we're not going to turn it into a business, but like, what do I need? Like, what's the bar to even think about doing something like this? And like, how do we even start?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you have an open source idea or something that you're developing in the open source space and you want to build a foundation around it, first of all, think about the license. The license model is the first thing that's going to give you the next steps into how do we maintain this ongoing? And thinking about what that maintenance looks like. Like, do you need a huge army like the Tor project to develop the system? Or is it a niche technology like Suricata that, yes, we need those people, but man, those people are hard to find. Finding Suricata developers is not easy. I am constantly on the lookout. But the license really is that first step to stepping in and saying, okay, if we have highly permissive license and we have a few people that are developing this thing and maybe lots more people will come, what do we do if it doesn't happen? What are our what if scenarios? So in some cases, it is very much of that startup mentality of planning ahead, understanding where the people are, understanding where the money's going to come from. And what I always urge open source, developers to think about is there a foundation that's already out there that you could bolt into? Back when I first joined OISF, I did have sort of this vision of being this much smaller Apache foundation for network security and bringing more of the technologies that are related to Suricata under one umbrella. But as I interviewed numerous open source projects, I had a litmus test. I was like, do you have a champion? Like a true champion? Do you have a way to monetize? Do you have a license model that is working for you? Are you going to have to change it? No offense, Elastic. Are you going to have to change your license model? But it's looking ahead to all these things. So if you can bolt on to a foundation that would welcome you in, do that. If you want to do your own thing, run it like a business. Really think ahead of it. And you can't always predict it. When Matt and Will and Victor were handing out perpetual license to Suricata, I don't think they thought that Suricata was going to be around in 5 years.
Sure.
Never mind 15 years into the future. I mean, it's so fun. Like, I've watched Victor turn gray. I'm like, you're gray hair. Now you're wearing glasses. And then he picks on me. He's like, yeah, but you're older than I am and you're wearing glasses. And so, but it's been a journey. And you have to, sorry to add one more point. The other thing is I think lots of times open source projects kind of get into their own little tunnel. You have to still be looking at the rest of the security space to see what other people are talking about and stay connected. You can't just kind of stay in your little corner. And I think for some open source developers, that's not their happy place. Their happy place is hanging out in the code.
For sure. And this is, I mean, this is kind of, I think, the point I'll end it on, and then I'll give you the last word. But you're right. A lot of open source developers, they want to develop open source, right? They don't want to manage business relations. They want to do marketing. They don't want to go find donors or members or whatever. That's what you do.
Yep.
If OISF didn't have you, it almost certainly wouldn't exist today. Right?
Well, thank you for saying that.
Right.
Yeah, I think it would probably look a lot different.
But I suspect this is true for any foundation. If you're a foundation without someone keeping the lights on and doing the things the developers don't want to do, you're just not going to be a foundation for very long.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, you do need to have that person that's going to focus on that. And I think that's where for OISF, that the working relationship that Victor and I established at the start has always worked. It's just, it's perfect. Not perfect every day, but it's a perfect, synergy, with a lot of respect and a lot of history and a lot of, oh, let's do that. And no, let's not do that. It's been a really, really great ride.
Amazing. I've learned so much, Kelley. I want to thank you so much. I'm going to be thinking about this conversation probably for at least a week, because it's been absolutely amazing.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm very excited about helping projects related to Suricata or other open source projects really understand how to do it well. I'm very lucky.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much, Kelley. I truly appreciate the time.
Thanks, Josh.